Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Allure of the Poor, sponsored by Dracaena Wines. Today, we are getting down and dirty about Merlot, and it is Merlot Month and November 8th. Don't quote me on that, but one day early November is also Merlot Day. So we are here with Nick Goldschmidt of Goldschmidt Vineyards, and we are going to talk all about Merlot. So hi, Nick.
How are you, Laurie?
I am good. I'm happy. I've got Merlot in my glass, so I am happy. So, it's tough to be sad when you've got Merlot in the glass. That's a good motto, right?
Yeah.
But before we actually get into the interview, I have to say kudos, I stand up and give some high praise. I went to the website to go check out some information on you, and wow, the 2022 Press Democrat North Coast Wine Challenge. There's just a few gold medals there.
Yeah. Well, I've been living in Healdsburg for 32 years now. Well, 33 villages in the Alexander Valley, which is where we focus on Merlot. I was a corporate winemaker for 25 years. I was a winemaker at Somm for 15 years. And during that time, run by Louis Vuitton and then Constellation. And then I left and went to run the world's largest wine company at the time called Allo de Mix. So we had 150 wineries in 7 countries. And then Jim Beam. So I've lived on an airplane for 25 years. But today I'm on my own. I would love to make and produce more Merlot, but unfortunately we've got a massive following for Cabernet. I still make Cabernet in 7 countries. In fact, on Friday I head off back down to Chile to get ready for the 2023 vintage. Wow. But Merlot, I've always been a right bank fan ever since as a consultant, I got to learn to be a consultant through a very famous person called Michel Rolland, who, for those who don't know, he's probably the #1 consultant in the world. And I got to work with him for 12 years at Somm. And he's from Pomerol. Now, Pomerol is right bank Bordeaux. And today, maybe he just wet my whistle with Pomerol, but I'm just a huge right bank Pomerol fan. And let's face it, Aubryon and Petrus are actually not bad wines. And they're made from Merlot, So, and I really think Merlot is an American palate wine. I mean, Cabernet is more spicy, a little bit greener, and the reason why a lot of Cabernet is made at high alcohol is because consumers don't really like that character. So if you make wine at higher alcohol, you can actually get rid of the green. So if you don't like spicy wines, drink Merlot, man.
I love it. That is so true. That is so true. And I am a right bank fan also. I am a Merlot lover, but I am a Cab Franc fanatic. So right bank is where I love Pomerol, but Saint-Emilion, like it's you gotta love it, right? It's a beautiful place. And I love your passion for Merlot. So we got set up for the right interview here for this. So I looked on the website, and you do have wines, as you mentioned, you're heading down to Chile. So if you would like somebody to come help you in Chile, I'll fly with you. I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
So
many people say they want to come, but I change wineries every 2 days, and it's a 6-week haul, man. Wow. And then I send the agenda, and everyone goes delete, unfriend.
Oh, I would not do that. I promise I would not do that. It sounds like a rough go, but in my eyes, you get that's 6 weeks of seeing and experiencing so much, and that to me would be quite the education versus, like I wouldn't mind staying in one place for 6 weeks either. You would learn, but to bounce around, you can see how different people do different things. And that to me is quite the experience.
Yeah, well, Chile and Argentina, where I work, have quite different experiences with Merlot. I mean, Merlot in Chile was started off with Carmenere, and then we gradually, obviously, we understood. But last week I was in Canada, so I run a couple of wineries in Canada as well. And one of the wineries focuses on Merlot. It's called Checkmate. And the Merlot style that we get there is fuller and more powerful, whereas what we look for in the Alexander Valley is more silky and round. But the key element that exists, and I also make New Zealand, I make Merlot in New Zealand and Australia, but the key element of those of Chile, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, California is clay. Now in Canada, we do not have clay, and clay is really important for Merlot more than Cabernet because clay holds water. And you know, when you add water to clay, it expands. Well, the roots, so when we plant Merlot, firstly, we go for really specific rootstock, usually 3309 or 1103 Paulson or 110R, and we'll cut into the clay soil so that the roots can penetrate into the clay, because then the clay closes in when it swells, and so those roots can maintain that water. Now, why is clay important for Merlot? Is Merlot berries weigh about 1.2 grams, whereas Cabernet weighs about 0.9 grams. And when you end up with an arid environment like we do now in Napa Sonoma, we get much more heat. And so when you dehydrate a Merlot berry, say 10%, that's a huge concentration of sugar, acid, and tannin. When you dehydrate Cabernet, it's a much smaller, 10% is much less significant. So it's really important for us to find soils that have a little bit of clay in them so that that Merlot can remain in good turgor all the way through the season. So when we bring that wine into the winery, when we bring that fruit into the winery, we can extract the heck out of it, you know? So we can, this Chelsea Merlot, which we're talking about first, is a Cabernet drinker's Merlot, because, you know, we want to have that richness and that power, but at the same time, Merlot is going to give us that soft, round, supple finish. And so that's what I look for, a little bit of clay.
Let's go back to the clay, because that's really cool, because most vines don't like wet feet, right? Most vines don't like wet feet. So when you have the clay and it hugs the roots like you're doing it, is it more like an insulation? Because clay also can hold on to the water. So is it kind of like, you know, not wet under there, more like a dripping sponge constantly?
Well, yeah, it's not. Yeah, you're right. I mean, vines don't like wet feet. I mean, potatoes like wet feet. All right, so we are not talking about potato country here. We're not talking about water tables that are, you know, a couple of feet down. We're talking about water tables that are 2 meters down. So, you know, 6 feet. So those roots have got to go 6 feet down to hit that clay, or in my best vineyard, about 1.5 meters. So 4.5 feet. Okay. So it's quite a distance for those roots to go down. Plus, the changing of the rootstock is really important. So yeah, when clay gets wet, it expands, and when clay dries out, you know, it cracks. And so one of the problems that we had growing Merlot and Carneros, I don't grow Merlot and Carneros anymore, is that when that clay cracks, it breaks all the roots, because those roots are tucked in there really tight. So in the summer, you get that black, you know, that marine clay that you get in Carneros. When that soil cracks, it breaks the roots as well, and that encourages spring growth, which is really important to the makeup of Merlot and Carneros. I find that a little bit too clayey for me, so I prefer to have down near the river where we get more alluvial soils rather than co-alluvial or alluvial. I prefer to be on a little bit of alluvial soil, and wherever you see a stone, you know there's clay. That's just the makeup of what soils are about. Yeah. But I don't believe in terroir.
Not at all. It's all rubbish.
It is, because if you irrigate, you change the terroir. If you add fertilizer, you change the terroir. If you plant with a different rootstock or a different row direction, you got a different winemaker making it, you got a different winery producing it, you change the terroir. It's only dry farming and organic farming is true terroir.
Awesome. You know, that I've never actually thought about it that way, but you are correct. You know, the more a human influences something, the less the nature is, and that is what terroir is, right? It's what nature is doing. So let's go to the different countries that you create. Now, are these all your own labels, or are you consulting for these other labels in different countries?
Primarily in the Alexander Valley and Napa, it's only 100% Goldschmidt vineyards. Okay. When I'm outside of the US, I don't do any. I know this is really weird, but I've been consulting for pretty much 30 years, but I don't consult for anyone in the US because I like to be really focused on what I do. And so that means spending 2 days with one winemaker. I eat with them, I drink with them, because culture is such an important part. So when I'm outside the US, I'm 100% consulting. We do own vineyards. Goldschmidt actually owns 2 vineyards in New Zealand, one in Chile and one in Argentina, as well, but they're very, very small. I consult for 26 other wineries around the world, but all New World. Yeah.
Wow, just a few wineries that you consult with.
Yeah, well, I'm old. I'm more of a sage. I'm a sage.
Sage. You know what? I've known you for, I don't know, 15 minutes. I love you. I love you. I love the
Yeah, that's
attitude.
because we're like 20 miles, we're like 4 hours apart, 5 hours apart. I hear that a lot. Look, lucky you're 5 hours away, man. We'd be eating and drinking. I'm like, oh, okay.
No,
Thank you.
now in the different countries, and you're growing Merlot, you're still looking for the clay soils, but are you? What other things do you look for that might be in Chile versus Alexander Valley? Is there something special for Merlot in each of those areas?
That's a really tough question because it's a super long answer because every appellation, the difference in Merlot between Colchagua, Cachapol, Puemo, Maipo, or Uca Valley, the Stauber, Lujan, Valunta, and the Central Valley. No, there's so many different appellations, so many different versions. But what I will say is that Merlot is more intrinsic to the terroir, or whatever that may be, than Cabernet, because if I give you Cabernet at 15.5 alcohol, if I give you Cabernet from Alexander Valley, most of what I do in Napa is in Oakville. So Alexander Valley, Oakville, Maipo, Colchagua, Cachapol, Rappel, McLaren Vale in Australia, Barossa, or up in the Okanagan, whatever. And I lined all those Cabernets up, and they're all at 15.5 alcohol. And I gave you which 5 wines were here. You couldn't tell them apart because at 15.5 alcohol, you removed terroir. But with Merlot, we can pick Merlot with a shorter hang time. Okay, so we talk about 100 days from flowering to harvest. That's what it is in Bordeaux. In Alexander Valley, it's about 140 days. For Cabernet in Napa Valley, about 130 days. But for Merlot, we can pick it at about 120 days. So because we know that the flavor, the tannin, and the sugar are all in about the right balance at that time frame. So we can make Merlot at 14 alcohol and be a true representative of where it's from. And that's what I look for when I'm making Merlot around the world in these different appellations, is being really true to type.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you another geeky question here then. So when you're looking at this, right, so you're saying around 14 alcohol or whatever. So let's go with Chelsea. Let's introduce Chelsea, because quite honestly,
Right.
I want to take a sip of this wine. So it's always rude to sip before I introduce. So we're going to look at this Chelsea Goldschmidt. And I am assuming that is a picture of your young daughter in a ponytail.
Well, the story's, so I have 5 children, okay, and 3 of them are daughters. And for a father, between the ages of 13 and 20, girls don't really talk to their fathers much because we're so stupid. So having a family project has been really interesting. That was the premise. So how did I get my daughters to work with me? So in the year 2000, I told my kids, when I lived in Chile back in the 80s, Pinochet, who was the dictator in Chile at the time, would cut off oil, power, water, food, whatever he wanted. So I was explaining to my kids about how to make wine without electricity. So we make 1 barrel a year, we hand pick it, we hand destem it, we pigeage, punch down, basket press, put it, I'm not stupid, but we do put it in a warehouse for a year, and then we bring it out and bottle it. So we do use a little bit of electricity to keep the barrel cool, but we bottle it, we hand bottle it, and we call it 5 gold hands, Goldschmidt, 5 gold hands unplugged each year. So in 2001, Chelsea said, oh, can I make wine with you? Now, all of my kids are scientists, which is really weird. So Chelsea's a genomist, so she's got a
Oh, wow.
master's in biology, and she's tracking viruses or whatever they do
That
in
is
DNA.
so cool.
So when she was 2, she lay on the ground and I traced around her head and she colored it in. That's where the label comes from. Now I have updated a little bit because she has hair now. And it's a really cool project to do this, because the vineyard used to be a vineyard that was sold to, when I was running Clos de Bois as part of Allo Demac, there's a very famous wine called Milestone. And this is the same fruit as Milestone, same vineyard, same winemaker per se. And and then to make it with her,
Special.
firstborn. I'm a firstborn too, right? So firstborns are very interesting children. And I could talk all day about that too. So
I'm daddy's little girl. I'm the only girl and I'm the baby. So
you're the youngest?
I am the youngest and I'm the only girl.
I have one. Well, yeah, I know what my youngest daughter is like. She's an engine. She's a civil engineer, and man, oh man.
Well,
let's go back to you. Let's go back to you.
Yeah. So, well, I'm a trained microbiologist, so I'm biology.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Yes. So,
no wonder you like wine.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Which bacteria can you smell?
Yeah.
Bit of pediococcus. Pediococcus, lactobacillus.
There was a time, because I don't do it anymore. I actually left microbiology because I was too hyper, and I went into teaching. And so, changes every 45 minutes or whatever, much more tuned to me, my hyperness. But there was a time when I was really doing it that I could do that. I could just smell it and tell you exactly what that microorganism was. But I guess it's like a foreign language. When you don't use it so much, you lose it, but
yeah, we could talk all day because I love micro. Because remember in the 80s when I was training to be a winemaker, I mean, we were taught to make sherries and ports. So you become very sensitive to spoilage bacteria and yeast. So even today, I can still identify lactobacillus. If I smell lactobacillus, I'm panic.
Yes.
Luckily, I don't smell it very often, but I'm very sensitive to yeast aromas and aromatics. And I find a lot of them really interesting. A lot of people talk. So this is native ferment.
Okay.
Native ferment and native bacteria for ML as well. So this wine is 100% Merlot, 100% from one vineyard, 100% vintage, and 100% hands-off, and it's vegan. So we don't make any additions to these wines at all. And I wish that we could change the law and put all of that on the label, but I know that it scares a lot of other wineries because suddenly they would have to adhere to these sort of rules. Mm-hmm. But yeah, anyway, I could talk all day, but just a really awesome project to do with Chelsea. I've learned a lot about her.
Well, I'm sure, when you're working together, stories get told, things, it's a conversation. You think about how much it's a conversation starter to just be drinking wine together. Never mind making wine together, with the conversations that occur over it. And, it's a nice bonding experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So now when you're looking for this, you're saying that you're looking for clay, for the clay soils. This is your estate? No,
this is a long-term contract. From a really old family. I'm working with the next generation now because the original owners have passed away. But yeah, I just have a long history. So what I am looking for though is I'm looking to really quite different to the Merlot that we make over in Oakville. So if you think about, and I learned a lot about this during COVID because I was 9 in my bubble. We drank 1,500 bottles of wine in 18 months. So if you think about Alexander Valley, you go red cherry, blueberry, black cherry in terms of flavor characteristics. Now in that Napa Valley, you start at blueberry, black cherry, plum. Okay. So slightly blacker fruit, slightly more red fruit for the Alexander Valley. Then because Napa Valley traditionally has more alcohol, you get more texture, and Alexander Valley has a little bit more, it's cooler in the Alexander Valley, so you get a little bit more brightness. So I really want to represent those two characteristics when I'm thinking about it. So what I noticed, and this is inherently true, I don't care what other people think because I'm so old now, that when I'm eating food, I drink Alexander Valley because Alexander Valley is more red fruits, more in your face, a little bit brighter, a little bit more acidity. Whereas Napa Valley, I drink with cheese. I drink it at the end of the meal because my palate is more tired. And everything I learned is a story. So I'm 27. I'm blending at Roses in Portugal for LVMH when I was running all the still wines for LVMH. And the reason why people are skinny in Portugal is because the food is really hard to eat, right? They eat these barnacles and it's 120 degrees and you're drinking port. So day 3, I said, dude, it's 120 degrees out here. We're outside drinking. Have you got any white wine? And they're like, Nick, we don't make white wine in Portugal. And the young lady in the restaurant goes, oh, don't worry about it. She brings a glass of white wine, filled up to the top like my mother does. The condensation's pouring off. And I go, shit, all the enamel has gone off my teeth. The roof of my mouth has gone. But what I learned at that moment is like that drinkability, am I hungry or thirsty? And I get that in Alexander Valley. Like it's very easy to drink 2 glasses of wine from the Alexander Valley back to back, where it's very hard to do that in Napa because you got more fructose, you got more carbohydrates, you got more alcohol. And so makes your palate tired. So now if you differentiate Merlot, you could throw Cabernet Franc in there too, and versus Cabernet, we can actually make these wines even fresher. So young Merlot, man, from the Alexander Valley, it's incredible. Really, really fun.
This lively is a fantastic description for it. It, like you typically get people saying, oh, a white wine makes you salivate or whatever, this is really making me salivate. This is making me want another sip. It is bright. The red fruit, there's a little like red plum, red cherry. But I'm also getting, and I don't know if this is, I get a little bit of like a little bit of anise or a little, licorice, but not strong. And then there's floral.
Yeah. Well, licorice is absolutely correct. And
Okay.
I strive to get a little bit, I know it's hard to do it without like explaining it, like with a glass between the two of us sitting at a bar and I'm explaining it to you. It's quite different. But this is a way, when I worked at Penfolds, when I worked at Grange, probably the most famous winery in Australia, definitely, and most famous Shiraz producer in the world, there's a very complexing agent they use, and they allow a certain bacteria to grow during the aging process, and then they hit it on its head. Because if you allow that bacteria, and every wine in the world has this bacteria, but it's a matter of how you control it. And if you allow it to age in the barrel for 3 years, I see it as, ethyl acetate or acetic acid. But if you can control it in the first 3 months, and then at the end of that time, it comes across as licorice. And that's exactly what you're tasting. So don't be put off by the aromatic of what licorice is, but in the mouth, you get this, you get this fullness and this richness. And so you get this beautiful elegance and ripe cherry, red cherry aromatic, but you get this like long, and then this wine just blows in the mouth. Like it has this big textural element. And that's really, it's a meal in a glass, right?
It's beautiful and it's elegant. It's elegant. And one of the things about Merlot, well, let me go back to other things that you're looking for during harvest time. We talked about you like the soil, the clay in the soil. You are looking for a production of 14% alcohol. So you're looking at a bricks. What is your bricks that you're kind of targeting in on that is kind of the flag that says, okay, I need to start paying more attention?
Well, bricks is really interesting because yeast are becoming more efficient. So
Right.
what you do is we used to multiply 24 bricks by 0.58. Today we multiply by 0.6 or 0.61. So our yeast are becoming more efficient, producing more alcohol. At the same time, our understanding of how to grow grapes is all about exposure, openness, and using VSP. We talk about vertical shoot positioning, not horizontal. Too much Merlot is grown horizontally. You got to straighten it up. Once you straighten it up, we get good light interception. And so, except for the 2020, which we're drinking today, because 2020 was a very difficult vintage. 20
That's an understatement.
Yeah, I know. So 21 and 22, I'm picking closer to 23 bricks. So hopefully the alcohols are going to be around about 13.5. I mean, all the 100-point wines that we're making outside of the US now are all under 14 alcohol, even Cabernet. I think the US Napa Sonoma to be the problem children. We need to get our alcohols down, and we need to be farming correctly to do that.
Absolutely. And now so Merlot is a child of my beloved Cabernet Franc. So that means it's a relative of Cabernet Sauvignon. So but you don't get those same pyrazines that are known in that Cabernet Sauvignon as frequently in a Merlot. So what about Merlot makes it different? Is it the mom that I can't pronounce her name, Marjolaine de Chaudeus, whatever?
Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah. No, the main problem with Merlot is the set. So it's during flowering, Merlot takes the longest of the other four, of the 5 Bordeaux varietals, or 6 Bordeaux varietals, if you want to include Carmenere. It's the longest flowering. And so you always have inclement weather at some point during flowering. And so when you look at a Merlot cluster, it tends to be a lot more open because a lot of berries don't form, whereas Cabernet Franc is especially efficient. It's a very short. So when you look at a Cabernet Franc cluster, it's very, very tight. And that's also a problem because we get a lot of berries that don't ripen in Cabernet Franc. And so number one, to make great Cabernet Franc, you got to drop half it on the ground. To make great Merlot, you really have to have that open cluster, because you can imagine those berries as individual all over the cluster get great light and heat, air exposure. And so you get much more even ripening with Merlot than you do with Cabernet Franc. And Cabernet Sauvignon is somewhere in between.
Okay. All right. That was like fantastic education.
It's what you paid for. It's all a conspiracy,
There you go. So, all right. So you've talked about, Alexander Valley, and the red versus the blue. That's phenomenal. And I'm not going to lie, you're the first person who has explained them in that way. So I absolutely love it. So let's talk about the Chelsea again, so I can drink more. Okay. In 2020, you said it was a difficult vintage. And I laughed at an understatement, but other than the obvious, what was difficult about 2020? What made this?
Well, yeah, we don't need to dwell on what happened in 2020. I mean, this is a common phenomenon throughout the world. I mean, we've had, in 2 countries that I've already named, we pretty much have fires every year. So, I mean, we know how to deal with fire, but we've got a lot of issues here with the way analysis is run and what people do with that analysis and how they treat the wine. And I really don't want to delve into the differences between guaiacol, formic guaiacol, serengols, creosoles, and all that. And that's the problem. Unless you understand that, you can't argue. So, but what really made it difficult was the speed of the vintage. So it was extremely warm and dry. It was the 3rd year of the 2020. It was the 2nd year of the drought. Okay. And we'd come up against, 19 was a really bright vintage, slightly cooler. 2018 was the in-your-face vintage. 2018 reminds me of 2013 and 1997. 2020 would remind me more like a 1998 or a 2002 vintage. But then then right up against it, obviously we've got 21 and 22, which, 2021. Now, admittedly, 2012 is probably the best vintage in 35 years. So there's not too much 2012 around, but 2021 is not that far behind. I think 21 is a phenomenal vintage. And then 22 is actually very similar. Maybe not quite as good as 21, because 22 is going to have a little bit more acidity in it than 21.
Okay.
But look, the last really bad vintage we had was 1989. Okay, so but if you line up all the bad vintages that we had in the 80s, we probably had 5 very weak vintages in the 80s, and since then we've had 4 other weak ones. But if you did that in Bordeaux, we'd probably have 10 strong vintages and 20 weak ones. So look, we make wine in the I live in California. I could live anywhere, but I make wine in California because it's the best place to make great wine. And it's really hard to say 2020 was not a strongest vintage, but it was a difficult vintage, challenging vintage. But in the end, the result
it's
was
beautiful
phenomenal.
wine. So
Yeah.
it may have been difficult, but it's a beautiful wine. Now, if you were picking, and I don't know if you can answer this or whatever, but if you were picking the ideal vintage, you are Mr. Heat Miser and Mr. Snow Miser together, and the Mother Nature coming together. If you can pick the perfect vintage, not vintage, climate going on, the season, the growing season for Merlot, what would Merlot want to give you? This is the perfect storm of fantastic vintage.
Well, the most important thing is not to have humidity in April.
Okay.
because that's when we're flowering, and Merlot is all about flowering. Now, we really like to have nice spring moisture so that the vines get off to a balanced start. We don't want to have the soil be too cold. So if we have some water in the soil profile, it actually prevents the soil from getting really cold. So, we talk about dry farming in some vineyards, but we can't dry farm if we don't get winter rainfall. And then subsequently, we don't want to have scorching heat, like we had in 2022 or 2020 or 2018, where we had, a week of really hot weather. Merlot, again, really suffers. So Merlot is a cooler varietal than Cabernet. This is why we grow Merlot in the Okanagan Valley in Canada. And we can get it ripe. We can't get Cabernet to its ideal condition, I feel, in Canada, but Merlot we can. So Merlot is destined for more of a cool climate situation, or it can handle a little bit more moisture, as long as it doesn't happen in flowering. So yeah, really it's all about April and early May.
And you were saying it's a longer flowering than...
Yes. So normally, if flowering, if I was to draw this, flowering, as I said, takes, between flowering and harvest, we can hit 130 days. So I can quickly draw this. I'm very fast.
That's okay. It gives me an opportunity to drink more Chelsea.
So this is what it looks like. So
nope, blur.
Background. All right, maybe I can't do it because I'd have to change my background. It's just that it takes so long to ripen, to flower versus other varietals. But they all ripen at different times.
And for those who, if you're not following it previously, so flowering is really kind of the dangerous part for any vineyard, for any variety, right? When it's flowering, that's when it is at the most susceptible to being that's damaged, basically.
Well, because after flowering comes set, and so people always, at set, everybody runs out and sees what they've got. But in 2019, we had a lot of wind, and wind during flowering is not good either. Not just heat, not just rain, but wind blows off a lot of those flowers. And if they don't, because they're asexual, right? So if they don't self-pollinate, you got a problem. I mean, otherwise the wind blows it all away. And when the wind blows, the vines, I don't know if you know about how, when you got the stomata of the leaf, that area of transfer of photosynthesis is variable for each variety. So Merlot, the transfer is much bigger than it is for Cabernet. So that transpiration area for Merlot, if it's windy, we're actually drying out the vine much quicker than we would be for Cabernet. So the Merlot is more susceptible to go into stress. I mean, I spend a lot of time, if you go on my YouTube channel, I got about 2,500 videos up, but you can see me rubbing the leaves, you know, like it's a big difference between rubbing a leaf that goes, you know, versus, you know, because you can feel, you know, my second degrees in organics and biodynamics, you can feel the moisture in the leaf. You can actually feel that just by rubbing the leaves. And I determine a lot of how I irrigate or how I farm based on the sound that I get from rubbing leaves.
I love it. I love it. You know, and people, you know, people talk about when it comes to harvest, it's in, you know, some people talk about it, it's in the lab, the chemistry has to be this or that, and that's what they go by. And I think the better wines are all done by the winemaker who's walking the vineyard, tasting the grapes, you know, doing that. That takes it to the extreme. If you can tell the difference, you know, when to irrigate, because you know the sound of the leaves, like you are being one with that vine, and it's difficult to have a bad product if you are knowing exactly what the vines are trying to say.
Yeah, I feel strongly though that winemakers need to have a chemistry background. If you do not
But
have
do
a
you want it to
chemistry,
be, but I don't think it should be the final decision.
no. So I think there's a line there. When you become a sage, you move from chemical winemaking to artistic winemaking. And people say, you know, they always ask, is it a science or is it an art? I'm like, well, it's a transition for me. So a lot of winemakers are going to disagree with this, but I feel that to be a true winemaker, you really, really need to have the educational background, the scientific background, to understand, you know, the makeup of the yeast and the bacteria and the plant pathology and stress irrigation and all the things that go into growing a vineyard and to producing the wine. Once you've had enough of that experience, then you can transition that into walking the vineyard and saying, hey, I can affect this by that, and I can change this character by that. I mean, you really got to have the base before you become an artist. And let's face it, you know, when we all run to the bunker, if, you know, God forbid we get one of those bombs dropped on us from a peninsula nearby, and we run to the bunker for 15 years, what are you going to take? I'm going to take a wine from a guy that's been making wine for 40, 50 years, not from somebody who's only made wine since 2017 and charging $500 a bottle because it's made in Napa. So drink old guys' wines.
There you go.
Because you know they're going to like, you know, you'll never see crusty stuff on my bottles because, you know, this is an anthocyan and this is a malvidin 3 glucoside, right? This is your anthocyan and it's purple. Heat, light, air, and time, tannin, red. More heat, light, air, and time, polymerization drops out, wine turns brown. Okay, when I go to the bunker, I want to drink wines that are going to be purple and red. And I can show you Chelsea that I made in 1990 and it's still red.
Right.
That's the key.
As I volunteer to travel to Chile with you, I volunteer to taste the 1990 Chelsea also.
There you go. Fair enough.
So when it comes to Merlot and Merlot Month, okay, it is, I'm sure it's kind of like, stop saying this, but you know what? You can't talk about Merlot without the horrible, horrible sideways effect. So what is your take on the sideways effect of Merlot?
That most people watching the movie didn't understand the sarcasm.
Thank you.
I mean, because he drank Merlot all the way through.
Thank you.
But people thought he was drinking Pinot. Look, whatever. I mean, I drink a lot of Pinot. But it's too warm here, man. I mean, when I make Pinot, I make it in the Southern Hemisphere, like at the equivalent level of Seattle. Okay. I mean, Russian River is successful because we have a fog line and it's interesting. And I mean, Paso Robles Pinot. My God, it's so damn hot down there. But I say the same thing about Sauvignon Blanc. So, you know, I go where it's easy, you know. So making Pinot around here is difficult because the alcohols are so high and, you know, but because it says Pinot, it says Russian River or whatever, you know, whereas Merlot is going to be less susceptible to, you know, it's more borderline. I mean, we live in an arid environment or becoming more arid. And Merlot is great because we can pick it early before a lot of the heat comes, and we can maintain its freshness and its viability, varietalness. And yeah, it's far more interesting and more complex and more going on. And as I said, you know, I like right bank, and I like the complexity of Bordeaux. I think Pinot, I like Pinot because of its simplicity. And I think you can get more simplicity from cooler, more moist environments. Yeah, no, I can get a very complex Pinot. Yeah, I see that. But when you talk about depth of and richness and that, you can get more from Merlot, I believe.
And one of the things that when I'm talking to people about Merlot, the first thing I say is, A, you didn't understand the movie. B, watch what he's drinking at the end of the movie, and then there's your, you know. But C, I do think that Merlot has come a long way. And I think that, and honestly, I think every grape variety has gone through this concept of it takes time to understand that grape variety. And at some point, Merlot might have been a bit overplanted and a little bit misunderstood. But as winemakers take their passion for Merlot and learn what Merlot can be if you're putting it in the proper environment, then it's quality wine. And that's my opinion. Is there was a lot of bad Merlot, but you know what? There was a lot of bad Cab, and there's a lot of bad Sauv, and there's Sauvignon Blanc, and there's a lot out there. But the winemakers who listen to what the grape is trying to or being able to do are the ones who can change it. So do you see yourself as like maybe not forefather isn't the right word, but, you know, a charge for Merlot?
Yes, obviously, I'd love to see it gain its true notoriety. I mean, it's still the #1 red grape planted in the world. It just so happens that Cabernet is more widely planted in Napa Sonoma. And you're absolutely correct. I usually don't talk about it, but when Merlot became hugely popular in the early 90s, everybody was planting Merlot everywhere. That did not happen when Pinot Noir became hot, because everyone knew Pinot was more climate susceptible, so they weren't going to grow Pinot in warm environments. So that was a savior for Pinot and kept the price of Pinot up, whereas Merlot was planted in a lot of warm environments where it really doesn't fit. You know, they thought, oh, I can grow Cabernet, therefore I can grow Merlot because it's Bordeaux. No, Merlot needs a cooler environment. You're going to pick it earlier, and as I said, you need a little bit more clay, whereas Cabernet can be planted on more of the loamy, free draining soils, which we have more of because, of course, we're a lot of alluvial soils in California. So Cabernet is more easy to grow in more places, whereas Merlot is not. But you're right. I mean, Merlot was overplanted, and therefore it was planted in places that shouldn't have been, and therefore the quality of, you know, probably 20% of the Merlot right when Sideways came out was probably shouldn't have been Merlot. So yeah, didn't taste as good.
Right. Absolutely. Now let's move on to Trig Point. So Trig Point 2019 Merlot Diamond Dust Vineyard.
Yes. So for
tell
those
me
that don't
about
know,
this wine.
this is about my father. So like me, we're all engineers. My children are all engineers. They're all scientists. And my father's an engineer. My brother's an engineer. My sister's an engineer. And a trig is a point of reference that we used to build on top of hills back in the days before GPS. Do you guys remember that? So from when my father was a land surveyor, so he could stand on one point, take a sight onto the mountain, and he could work out the distance and how far it was across the river and where to put the property line and build the house. He was in the 4th expedition to the South Pole, and 1958, And so 8 of them went down. A few of them were killed going down a crevasse, but my father survived. There's places named after my father in the Antarctic. And in
Wow.
those days, of course, there was no wood. There was no wood to build trigs. And so they built them out of stone. They're called cairns, and they're built in the same shape. And so my office here is called Base Camp, which means, where they used to come back to Scott Base, which was the only base down there. The Americans had built McMurdo Sound by then, but he was based at Scott Base and surveyed the Ross Ice Shelf. So this is sort of a tribute. If you read the back label, it talks about my mathematician father. And even today, he's 89. And whenever you mention a number, he can go, here's a rhyme for every number. He can remember numbers. He knows how far it is. He can still pace out, 50 meters and miss by, a couple of centimeters. He can, it's
awesome.
crazy. He may not, appreciate life or as fit as he used to be. I mean, he was super fit for so long. But this is all about mathematics and trig being the point of reference for location, and in this case, a point of reference for a great Merlot vineyard that we make this. This vineyard is a little bit different to the Chelsea. This vineyard comes from much closer to Healdsburg here. It's a very steep vineyard, and where we grow the Cabernet called Trig Point, and then the Merlot comes from closer to the river. Probably, it's going to be up there with Chelsea. It's a phenomenal Merlot vineyard. Again, I've been making wine here since 1995. So it's owned by the Passalacqua family, and I've been working with the Passalacquas, again, second generation now. Just a great family to work with. And this is a tribute to both my father and to an old family heritage such as the Passalacquas.
So now going back to your map that you were demonstrating before, where does this fall in?
All right. So if Chelsea's a little bit more red fruit, or has a little bit more structure and zippy, this vineyard being a little deeper in soil is going to be a little bit more textural than I could draw it on a chart, but it's not going to show up. Again, anyone who's interested, you send me a video, an email, I'll send you the link, and there's a video where I describe black fruit, red fruit, structure and texture. So Trig Point's going to be a little richer than what Chelsea is. Chelsea's going to be a little brighter and second glass material. The Trig Point's going to be just a bit more complex, a bit bigger, and so quite different vineyards, quite different exposures, and therefore completely different wines. But again, one vineyard, one vintage, one variety, and all vegan.
And so let's talk about harvest dates between these two.
Wow.
Generally speaking.
Trig Point is about 3 weeks after Chelsea.
Wow.
Much, much, much cooler location. The vineyards are about under 15 minutes apart. So, but Alexander Valley looks like an upside down Y. Okay. Chelsea comes from, Geyserville would be in the middle. So Chelsea comes from the east side of Geyserville around here, and Trig Point comes from down here. So both vineyards are quite interesting because they both face north, and north is a cooler site, but the Trig Point vineyard is much lower down, much closer to they're both close to the river, but the Trig Point is just a little bit cooler in its location. There's more trees around, more protection, more of a valley, whereas the Chelsea is more on a open plain. Well, not really, but I mean, you get more, it's more open for sure.
And in terms of, so the growing season, is everything like about 3 weeks later at Diamond, or is it just like, are they flowering around the same time and then it takes longer to ripen at Diamond? How is their life cycle?
Yeah, so Diamond Dust it's an actual real road. Diamond Dust was the name of a road, but it's a paper road. Again, it was a survey line that was made, but the road was never built. So we discovered this on an old map. No, the Cabernet on that same site we picked before the Merlot, which is really unusual. The Cabernet is really a thinner soil. It's a very, very steep hillside. It's over 30%, which these days you can't plant that sort of steepness. This was planted a long, long time ago. And the Merlot is much lower down, and so the soil is a little deeper. The clay is a bit further down here. So yeah, it's dramatically later than the Cabernet. I know my assistant winemaker goes, I can't believe that Merlot is like, it's one of our last Bordeaux vineyards to plant, and yet it's Merlot. But it's also planted on an old California sprawl, so it's more of a bush vine situation with big canopy cover. So we're keeping that cluster covered from the intense sun that we get these days, whereas the Cabernet is grown on a VSP, much more vertical and more exposure. So that's, we get less crop in those situations. So the Cabernet will come in earlier than the Merlot, yeah.
And so facing north, is that something that if you're looking to plant Merlot, is that something that you want to keep in mind? You want to find a site that can be northern facing?
Yeah, I came to California to make Pinot. I learned a lot about Merlot making Pinot. So the ideal, at this latitude, you need to plant Pinot facing east, morning sun. So the east facing sites are going to be cooler than the afternoon facing west face. So if you want to be even cooler, north. So ideally you want northeast facing, because it's morning sun only, and then the afternoon you get shade. Now you think north-south, right? But in the northern hemisphere, you want to plant 2 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whereas in the southern hemisphere, you want to plant the other way, because remember, the sun moves, right? So my ideal measurement is on August 15, which I always remember because of my wife's birthday. August 15 at 3 p.m., I want no shadow. All right. Because I think that is the hottest part of the season. So I want the sun directly overhead on August 15.
And then you can use a trig to figure that out when you're planting a vineyard?
I could.
You know what? That is so cool, because I never even thought, you think about the vineyard sites and the arrangements and, for like Cab Franc, right? You want to burn off those pyrazines, but not too much sun that it starts to turn the grapes to raisin. So there is that distinction of how you're planting it so that you get the sun that you need, and then cooler when the hot sun is there, it's protected, you get that. But that's very specific. August 15th. No, that's very, very specific.
Well, I'm a scientist and I'm firstborn. This is not a happy mix. Yeah.
Oh my God. So what about the fidelity? So now we're going into a blend. So this is a red wine, still from Alexander Valley, and this is Fidelity. So first, let's start off with the name. Where is Fidelity coming from?
Well, it's a funny story. So a friend of mine who owned the vineyard at the time, he'd sold his winery to a famous person, and he had a 3-year contract on the grapes, and he hadn't been paid. So he calls me up and says, Nick, I'm going bankrupt. Can you help me? And this is sort of how I got started on working with small family businesses. He was the first one to really get me going. This is while I was still at LVMH at CME. And I said, all right. I went up and I knew the winemaker. And so I tasted all the 1999, the 2000, 2001. They were all in tank. And I said, man, these wines are really good. 3 vintages. Let's put all the 99 together, all the 2000 together, all the 2001. And it was predominantly Merlot with a bit of Cab Franc, and Malbec. And I called up a buddy of mine, a large retailer in a big state. And this is Nick Goldschmidt, winemaker, right? Brilliant marketing. I'm really good at marketing. So let's launch a wine on Valentine's Day. We'll call it Fidelity, and we'll put a big heart on the label. Wow, what a great idea. So 6 months later, after everyone got over Valentine's, the buyer calls me up and goes, Nick, I don't want the last 500 cases. I'm like, dude, I haven't come out of the closet, man. I still work for LVMH. So I called up my 3 mates who were distributors out on the East Coast, New Jersey, Indiana, and Boston, Massachusetts. they agreed to take the 500 cases. Next day, 92 points, best by wine enthusiast. The big buyer calls me up and goes, Nick, can I get my wine back? So today on the label, you'll see there's a broken heart.
It's a broken heart.
And this is a screw you to all the large companies in the retail business of screwing up the wine industry and trying to put us hardworking family businesses in the pocket of the big guys. So this is our little revolution, our little fight back. So you will not find Fidelity in large retail. You will have to find it in small independent retailers or wine lists. So that's where the name Fidelity comes from.
That may be the best story ever.
Yeah.
So this is Merlot and Cab Sauv, you said, correct?
Yes, I lied. It's 85% Merlot and it's about 10% Cab, and then I got a little bit of Malbec and Petit Verdot.
Oh, okay.
And I've got Cab Franc planted and will be included in the 2022 vintage. Yeah.
All right. So it's kind of like a true Bordeaux.
Yes, and for this price, you cannot buy true Bordeaux at this price, because normally a red blend will include Syrah, which you can crop a lot heavier and it's a lot cheaper. So people normally put in, 10-15% Syrah to lower the price. There is no Syrah, there's no Zinfandel, no Petit Syrah. This is only the 5 Bordeaux varietals.
And so what does this retail for about?
You can get it under $20.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, so that's in fact, all 3 of these wines, Trig Point's going to be a little bit more expensive, probably going to be 22-ish, 23.
Wow.
But Chelsea and Fidelity, you can get them under $20. And if you're in California, since we're both in California, you can get Chelsea at some of the Safeways around California. But yeah.
Excellent. And so is the blend, so then I'm guessing it's not a field blend. You're harvesting separately, there's a smile. Is it a field blend?
Yeah, no, it's like, you talk about field blending all the time. The Italians used to plant Cab, Merlot, Zin, Mourvèdre, Syrah, Petit Syrah, everything in the vineyard. And that's, so that's where the full term field blending came around. We make a Carignan from a 150-year-old vineyard and a Zinfandel and a Petit Verdot from 120-year-old vineyards, which is extremely rare because these vineyards were actually planted as single varietal, which is unbelievable. So I have these 3 vineyards, which we sell them under a brand called Grace Point. But no, when it came to Bordeaux varietals, these were planted after. They were planted before Prohibition, but predominantly after Prohibition. And so, yeah, by that time, winemakers started sneaking into the vineyard and making decisions. And one of those decisions was, let's keep all the varietals separately because we want to pick them all on the same day, and we don't want to,
right. And I think with Bordeaux, there's a bigger. I think to be a field blend, they need to be ripening at about the same time, and that's not so true.
We know that doesn't happen.
Exactly.
Another conspiracy, but no.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so it's always going to be a Merlot based?
Yes.
Okay.
I have, again, it's a single vineyard, but in this instance, it's the only wine that we make a blend. We make a Zinfandel with a little bit of Petit Syrah, and then we make this red Bordeaux blend. And this wine's been around for now since 2000. Well, I told you since 1999, so it's been around a long time, and has a great following. It's we don't make too much of it, the Fidelity, but it has a great following. Yeah.
So if it's always Merlot based, always legally Merlot, why do you choose to put red wine on it versus?
Because everything I do is one vineyard, one vintage, one variety. So this is a situation where it's not one variety, and I don't want to confuse the few friends that I've got left that what it is. So I do want to put red blend on it, and I can't put Cabernet, Merlot, Franc, etc. because every vintage the blend is a little bit different because it depends on yield, and because we have an authority that regulates wine labeling, and I know I'd have to submit each vintage. If I change the percentage by 1%, I'd have to submit into 50 states for 50 different legal reasons, and it's just too hard. So unfortunately, we have to put red blend on the label. I wish I could put Bordeaux blend, but legally I can't do that.
They don't allow Bordeaux to be on the label either.
No, it's an appellation. So yeah.
They make it so difficult.
I know. Man. Maybe we just, but that's what makes life exciting.
That is true.
What makes life exciting is having to explain something, and gives us an opportunity and to educate and to enthrall and show our passion, and what makes me different to my friends around town here. And yeah, no, if I'm not excited, things are going to get boring. So
that is true. You have to remain excited. You have to remain excited.
Absolutely.
Well, where can, if I pin you down and I say, I need you to tell our listeners 3 things about Merlot that you want them to remember most heartedly strongly hearted, what are 3 things about Merlot? Well,
firstly, if you don't drink Merlot, you're an idiot.
I like that.
Because Merlot is like the perfect American food, American palate wine, and it just doesn't get enough credence. Secondly, there are a couple of extremely large players in the Merlot game who are doing extremely well. But look out for us guys who are single vineyard, and it's single vineyard because we have one called Diamond Dust and the other one called Guidestone Rise. So that these are single vineyards. And I think that people say, well, if it's single vineyard, it's not going to be as complex. Well, I believe that because of the vineyards we have, I can make a really complex wine from those vineyards. I don't pick Merlot on the same day in those vineyards. I usually pick it 2 or 3 times, so I get different blending options, and that's what makes the wines really complex. And then thirdly, Merlot is way better value than Cabernet.
Definitely.
And if you want to contact us, you can just send an email. You've got my email address there, nick@goldschmidtvineyards.com.
It will be in the notes.
If you change it to wine@goldschmidtvineyards.com, no problem.
And I have another question. There's certain varieties that we hear more about clones, right? Pinot, clone. Chardonnay, clones, whatever. What about Merlot? Are you working with different clones in these different vineyards? Is it more rootstock focused? Is it more clone?
Should have asked this one at the beginning.
I know. I'm sorry. It just popped in my head.
I don't like clones.
You don't like clones? Okay.
No, because you probably heard of Dijon clones and UC Davis clones and Espeguet clones, the Italian versions, but they talk about clone 95 being a little more muscly than clone 96 when it comes to Chardonnay. But guess what? Those 2 vines are right next to each other. Okay. Marsanne. So we make a lot of Chardonnay, but we don't use any clones. I use the old Marsanne, the old field mass selections that were collected for certain varietal characteristics. Unfortunately, because we had to replace AXR1 in 1989, that, we're talking about 2 forms of vinifera, right? Vitis vinifera, Cab Chard, Merlot, but Vitis labrasca is the rootstock, Blanderi rupestris, So when we took those old mass selections, field selections, and put them on top of the new rootstock, we got virus, leaf roll, stem pitting, corky bark, etc. But in the Russian River, we have Goldridge sandy loam. That Goldridge sandy loam soil, that's one of 3 soils, Huachica and Franciscan. If we are on a Goldridge sandy loam, we don't need to replace the rootstock. The AXL1 vineyards that we make Chardonnay from still exist. And so we only deal with mass selections and field selections. Cabernet, same thing. I've gone back to some of the original heritage. They call them heritage clones, but they're not. They're heritage field selections. Turkey Hill, which is one where clones 7 and 8, the most famous clones 7 and 8 came from Turkey Hill. So I know where the vineyard was. So I went back to the original vineyard and identified clean looking plants, and I took cuttings from there. Merlot is more difficult. Merlot, there's not as much old plant material around for Merlot, but there's mainly one clone. That's 181 is the main clone that we use. And the best thing about it is, like I said earlier, it has a much better set than some of the others. And Pinot is kind of in between if you're interested. I mean, Pommard is an old field selection, which is now clone 2A, cleaned up clone 2A. But yeah, there's, the old Swan. You've heard of Swan. The Swan is not a clone. Swan's a selection. So yeah, Merlot is probably the most difficult. To be honest, I don't know any mass selection Merlot plant material out there. To be honest, I haven't looked. But yeah.
Oh, well, very cool. And now if somebody wants to come taste your wine in person, they can come visit you.
Yes, you can come and visit me personally in my office.
At base camp?
So at base camp. So we're not open to the public anymore. We decided to change the way we talked about our wines, and we really want to have intimate one-on-one conversations. So you can contact us directly, and myself or my assistant winemaker or my wife will host you. And we love to have people out here, and like we have people here all the time tasting. And if you're lucky enough, we'll take you on a quick vineyard tour as well, or take you up to the winery and taste some wine. So it depends on how much time you've got and how much interest you have. But yeah, no, we'd love to see you. Love all people to come. And yeah, if you can't come, as I said, you can go to Goldschmidt Vineyards on YouTube, and you'll see a lot of YouTube videos up there with what we're doing.
Okay, and I will have that YouTube channel linked in the show notes along with your website so that they can find you and contact you. And thank you so much for the Merlot knowledge and sharing and opinions. I absolutely love it. And I did pour myself a little bit more of the Chelsea so I can raise a glass and say Sláinte. And thank you very much. And here is to Merlot taking its place where it deserves.
Certainly, Lauren. If you want to see where I am in the world, you go I do use Instagram. So each day I put up a location of which country I'm in and which vineyard I'm at. So yeah, if you follow Goldschmidt_vineyards on Instagram, you can see exactly where I am each day. So yeah.
That is perfect. It's like where in the world where in the world is Waldo.
Yeah,
I couldn't think of his name.
Now we have GPS.
Yes, a lot easier, right? Well,
Laurie,
thank
you. And from I love Fresno. I love being down there. I still teach the odd class down at Fresno State.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, on style and quality. I teach a class down there. But yeah, no, fantastic, awesome. Really appreciate your time. And Merlot month is not long enough. We need Merlot year.
There you go. Sláinte.
Cheers.